I've been looking forward to having this chance. On Money Talks, I'm proud of the fact that we've been talking about the impracticality of the renewable energy agenda. Well, I'll tell you someone who is, and we were early in this. I'll tell you someone who was a lot earlier, Robert Bryce, written for a ton of publications, New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Forbes. But you know what? Many's better known now for the Power Hungry podcast, a terrific podcast. But it's terrific because of the information he brings to the public. And that's why, I take time to listen and read what Robert said. He wrote the book Power Hungry, The Myths of Green Energy and the Real Fuel of the Future. And I'm not sure if anybody was sooner in that or, before that. No, he was on his own on that one, talking about the hard reality that we're going to need oil, we're going to need coal, we're going to need natural gas, if we're even going to do renewables. That's why I'm so pleased that he's found time for us here. Robert, thanks for finding that time.
Well, thanks a lot, Mike. Happy to be with you.
As I say, you've been immersed in this broad subject, the broad energy subject for such a number of years. I know this is the Barbara Walters question, but can you give me what you think the biggest myths are that are still prominent out there? I mean, we get inundated in Canada with our government talking about renewable energy, and to me, in a completely impractical manner. We'll be zero emissions by Tuesday.
Right. I thought it was Monday afternoon, Mike, but okay, Tuesday. Yeah, we'll give them a little extra time. Biggest myths. Well, they are persistent and they are whoppers. But I'd say the first one is that we're going to make a quick transition. This is something that is obvious when you look at the history of the energy and power sectors. Here we are in 2023. What is that? 141 years after Edison used coal on the Pearl Street plant in Lower Manhattan. And today, coal still provides 37% of global electricity. And for all the talk about coal being dead, the fact is that coal demand continues to rise. So this is indicative of the, what is called the Lindy effect, a new idea that I've just recently come to, which when you have these big systems, whatever they are, whether it's a big installed base of automobiles or power plants, they are going to tend to stay in place for a long time, right? Kind of the inertia of the system. So I would say that is the biggest myth, this idea that we can do something in short order. And I think that particularly in the wake of COVID, with the labor shortages, with supply chain disruptions, that's much more obvious now. We are not going to switch to something else. And of course, the issue being wind and solar, we are not going to shift our economy over to those two sources of intermittent energy anytime soon at scale.
Yeah, and what would you think is a more realistic timeline? And I know I'm not putting words in your mouth that
never?
You think that it's going to happen.
Does never fit?
Yeah.
It's like my friend Bob Heller, he loves to tell it. It's his favorite cartoon. It was in the New Yorkers, and there are two people standing there and they're looking at their calendars or whatever. And one says to the other, "How about never? Does never work for you?" And I bring that up because it's funny, right? But the Jude Clementi makes a good point. He said, we talk about electricity, we talk about wind and solar. Well, okay, they're fine. And they are growing. There's no doubt about it. I have solar panels on the roof of my house. There's no doubt that the solar market is growing. So is wind. But those are producing electricity, and we don't use electricity in transportation, except to a very, very limited degree. So this ignores the fact that the overwhelming majority, some what 97% of our transportation depends on oil. So this transition that we're talking about is only affecting a very small part of the overall energy consumption, that we need, the overall energy and power that we need to run the economy.
Yeah, it's so mind-blowing, of course, how simplistically we've talked about this transition, and yet how sophisticated it is, and I know this is sort of sarcastic and that's probably not that powerful, but from a lot of people who don't know where their electricity comes from other than the wall, are leading the way. And some people are much more aggressive than I am about calling that out. But, and again, my favorite example is they didn't understand that the wind doesn't blow every day or the sun doesn't shine. I mean, that's the level of sophistication we're talking about here.
Sure.
And I know there's so many places, we can go with this, but let me just stay with materials for a second.
Sure.
I mean, we're not in the ballpark. If you want lithium-ion batteries, well, good luck on a lot of, and again, that's a great example. We could be talking about how long they last. We could be talking about recycling. We could be talking all of that stuff, but I'll just start with where you're getting your cobalt from, buddy. Where you're getting your lithium from. And one of the things that you've tracked, and you are, again, the pioneer in this, is we don't talk about the blowback from local communities, for example. We didn't
Sure.
talk about that at all coming from China for rare earth minerals, but you've done more work than anyone I'm aware of in the blowback from local communities. So maybe just focus on that for a sec, because they're not going to hear it anywhere else.
Sure. Well, and a lot of the coverage, and has been, now I will say, the Washington Post has done a couple of really good stories in the last month or so on this,
Yeah.
and I'm saying they're good because both they quoted me, and they cited my work, the Renewable Rejection Database,
Yes.
which I've been working on now since 2015. But the reality is that in Canada, I mean, look in Ontario, you have over 90 local communities who've declared themselves unwilling hosts to wind turbines. There's been resistance to wind all across Canada. Look at the more recent one. I think it was in Newfoundland, where local communities blocked the road to prevent the construction of a wind project there. Look at what is happening in Europe. Massive opposition to these large scale wind and solar projects. So I'll just follow up on the Renewable Rejection Database. This is work I'm very proud of, and why did I do it? Because I'm just damn stubborn, right? I just decided, okay, well, as W. Edwards Deming said, in God we trust, all others bring data. Well, so I had to start collecting the numbers and the data and citing each township, each county, each place where there have been a rejection or restriction. And now we're at close to 400 rejections or restrictions of wind energy. This is just in the U.S. and over 130 rejections or restrictions of solar. And no one on the other side, and by that I mean the promoters of the weather dependent renewables, have challenged me on any of it because they don't want to acknowledge, Mike. And this is the part that just my late brother John Bryce said grills my cheese. They just assume that all those people who live out there in rural areas are just those bumpkins, those hay seeds. They just don't know what's good for them, and we're going to force them. And that is in fact what is happening in many of these cases. These big companies, including NextEra and Invenergy, and even Mid-American Energy, a subsidiary of Berkshire Hathaway, are trying to force local communities to accept big wind and solar projects they don't want. Imagine if this was ExxonMobil or Chevron.
Yeah.
What would the media coverage be? I think it would be somewhat more than what we've been seeing, Mike.
Well, what's also never gets reported, and I think this one, okay, yes, you did mention the Washington Post a month ago. Come on, this is an issue. Yes, and I say better late than never, but that is late, to
Sure.
this issue. But I would say this: they also don't report that who's opposing. A lot of times it's the local people, but it's environmentalists who also oppose these projects. I think that just, I'm trying to think of the name of the Eco Blank that's proud of the fact they got 180 lawyers involved trying to stop these projects.
Right.
And that's another aspect that, as I say, people are listening today haven't heard that.
Well, but let me underscore that by pointing out what's happening on the U.S. East Coast, where you have these big NGOs, and I don't call them environmental groups anymore. I don't think they're actually pro-environment. I think in many cases they're just anti-environmentalists. I think what we're seeing is the death of environmentalism, and it's being replaced by climatism and renewable energy fetishism. And this is very clear when you see the issues around the North Atlantic right whale and the efforts to build massive amounts of wind energy capacity in the ocean on the East Coast. It is very clear. You look at the maps, and the maps of where these projects are planned to be built are right on top of known habitat of the North Atlantic right whale, and across the board from the Sierra Club and Natural Resources is crickets. Or they're even saying, oh, it's not wind turbines. The whales are dying from something else. Well, wait a minute. Imagine again, if this was the oil and gas industry trying to do what the wind industry is doing, it would be an uproar. There would be people getting arrested in the protests. And instead, because the wind business is like, oh, no, never mind. No problem. We're not really concerned about the whales. I mean, it's not their fault. It's truly incredible. I mean, it really is, Mike. And I find it just disgusting on a whole lot of levels. I do not, if it isn't clear, I don't like these groups.
Yeah. But again, this is symptomatic of the entire approach here, that never was always politicized. It was looked at as an opportunity to gain power, looked at, to raise money. There's a lot of other motives that were involved, as you just pointed out, besides climate change, or lowering emissions, I should put it. Now, I'm not even getting into that debate. I'm just saying, if you're trying to lower emissions, we're not going about it the right way. Just, Robert, just as I'm up in Canada, of course, but the government has their own environmental commissioner who said, Canada, for all the talk, because I think per capita, Canada talks more a good game than anyone else. We might rival the Green Party in Germany. I mean, that's where we're
Ooh,
at.
now that's a bold statement, Mike, but go ahead.
I know I'm stepping out on a limb on that one, but we are last in G7 in emissions reductions, but the most in the hot air talking about them, so.
But I'll tell you how I see, Mike, I've followed, your fellow Canadian Chris Kiefer and his work on nuclear in Canada. And I think, where I see, I'm pretty bullish on Canada in that regard. What I see now, I'm in Texas and I'm watching it from a distance, but I've had Chris Kiefer on my podcast and talked to him many times. He's a friend of mine. And I'm really proud of the work that he's done and how he has really reinvigorated the focus on CANDU reactors in Canada. You've got the best uranium deposits in the world. You have these incredibly designed, very durable reactors here, and he has helped catalyze the movement to not just refurbish them, to expand them. I mean, it's really been quite remarkable. So, and here's my view on nuclear and climate is, you don't have to be concerned about climate to be pro-nuclear. I mean, I think the other attributes of nuclear are really critical here, and the weather resilience and the affordability, the long-term jobs, the infrastructure. Those are things that, and labor in particular is one of the reasons why Kiefer's had such success, is getting labor on his side, pointing out these are good, long-term, high-paid jobs. And so I think there's Canada, I really think, is in many ways leading the world in terms of blazing a path in terms of a new view on sustainable, and I hate that word, I don't like that, of durable energy and power networks.
Yeah, I would agree. We've had a chance to talk with Chris, and I have a tremendous respect for the dedication they've shown. And yes, they have had. I think that's the most positive thing I can say. I mean, literally, when you look at people in our government not acknowledging the challenges with supply chains, the challenges with China dominating rare earth, as just an example, refining all of the things around that. Thanks to Chris and his group and the people who've worked tirelessly there, they made progress in Ontario, which is obviously significant. And British Columbia is lucky because it's hydroelectric. You know what I mean? It's, Quebec's been lucky on that regard too. And you say, we've got the uranium deposits. And that brings me to another thing on the bigger issue, if you don't mind, because you've been writing about it, which is, hey, and we've been chronicling this. We were bullish on uranium. Remember Sprott, Sprott went the whole uranium fund thing. And we were bullish on that same conference, by the way, in February of 2020, saying that's one of our, long-term picks is buy uranium, the top quality uranium companies, BHP, Cameco, that kind of stuff. And so we've been measuring that progress, and whether it's, Japan saying, wait a second, we don't care about Fukushima anymore, we're going to do more. South Korea saying, I think we can put 22 up tomorrow morning. All of those things. There's clearly been a movement towards uranium, but that doesn't guarantee the supply side. And that's something, again, you've brought to the public's attention.
Well, and this is something that I think is, I've written 6 books, and by the way, you didn't plug my Substack. I'm going to plug that mercilessly.
Oh, I will.
robertbryce.substack.com. And I have a piece out just published talking about uranium supplies and the fact that the U.S. has really sleepwalked into this situation where in the 1980s, we were the world's biggest exporter of nuclear fuel. Now we're the biggest importer. And we quit mining uranium for all effective purposes. Now, our uranium ore is not as good as Canada's, not as good as Kazakhstan, but we still have reserves. And we could say the same about oil and gas in the United States. Our reserves aren't as big as Saudi Arabia's, but still we're producing it. But the point here is that we have fallen asleep. I'm using the papal we here. In the United States, we're a lot of effort, a lot of money, a lot of capital is going toward small modular reactors, the ideas of the nuclear renaissance. But in all the midst of this, there's been an ignorance and a blithe kind of, assumptions that we're going to have enough fuel. And hold on just a damn minute. No, after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, those fuel supplies are really problematic. And remember that the U.S. is going to be competing now with European countries and China for fuel out of Kazakhstan for enrichment, that this is a global game now. And we've lost this focus on our energy security when it comes to this critical energy commodity, which is uranium and enriched uranium, HALEU, low enriched uranium. We've lost focus on that, and we better get sober right damn quick.
Yeah, but typical of every aspect of this, sort of the energy debate. I mean, you mentioned coal a bit ago, and it's related to
Sure.
nuclear. I mean, is there a bigger farce than Germany having spent something upwards of $500 billion to do renewables? And of course, they shut down the last nuclear plant in April. The last couple go
Right.
down, and who's the biggest importer of coal now? In Europe, who's the one who's using the most for their grid? I mean, you can't make
Well,
this
and
stuff
remember,
up.
the height of it, Mike, was when it was late last year. I published a piece. I think it was in Forbes. I'm only writing on Substack now, but you can find it on Forbes. They took down a wind project in Germany to make way for the
Yes.
expansion of a lignite mine. I
Yeah.
mean, if you wrote that, no one would believe it, right?
Yeah.
It's like, oh, come on, that doesn't happen. No, in fact, it did happen. And
Yeah.
it's indicative of what I call the iron law of electricity, which is people, businesses, and countries will do whatever they have to do to get the electricity they need. And this is what we see in Germany. And since we're on the topic of Germany, I'll just quickly add, I do short videos. I call them about a minute. And I put them on TikTok and Twitter and the rest of it. And I did one the other day. Germany is in recession now.
Yeah.
The staggering increases in energy prices, this foolishness of trying to pin their economy to renewables, closing their nuclear plants, and the heads of two different companies, RWE and Evonik Industries, both were quoted in the Daily Mail just the other day saying, we're starting deindustrialization. This is energy policy disaster was the phrase used by the head of Evonik, which is a very big chemical company. So Germany is showing the world what not to do, and they're doing it with the typical kind of German pride, I guess. I don't know there's no explaining it. I don't get it, Mike.
But the inexplicable part, or I guess it is explainable if you're an ideologue, but what lessons have they learned in Europe? I mean, I look at some of the notes coming out of the EU, in the parliament and stuff. You have people who are opposed to it, but still the thrust is, by the way, I've learned nothing. I find it absolutely incredible that the harsh reality of things like the deindustrialization, estimates of 20% of the German industrial manufacturing base has been lost now, transferred to other more reliable jurisdictions.
Yeah.
What would get your attention? What Great Britain having a 1,200% increase in electrical costs, September of 2021, electrical bill, wouldn't that get your attention? It's unbelievable to me how nothing's been learned.
Well, let's talk about Britain then too. Yeah. So I forgot the name of the woman who was the prime minister for about 6 weeks before Rishi Sunak took over.
Theresa May.
Okay, is that right? Okay,
I'm guessing too. She was there so briefly. Who knows?
Yeah,
but yes,
right.
I think
she was there for a cup of coffee.
Yeah.
But then she's replaced by Liz Truss. Oh, okay, yeah.
Okay, so we'll back up just for a sec. And we'll cut it at where Robert said, I can't remember her name, and then I'll interject and go.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, so you mentioned Britain. Let's talk about.
Sorry,
Britain.
we have to give it a silent spot so they know where to edit.
Okay.
Sorry, Ron. Yeah, I think her name was Liz Truss, and she was the one who was going to do, said we were going to go back to shale, and then they turn that over. That would have been a good thing, but yeah, it's unreal.
And isn't it incredible? And she was a Tory, and she's replaced by the Tory Rishi Sunak, who one of the first things he does when he gets back into office is say, "Oh yeah, we're going to ban fracking. We're not going to repeal the ban on fracking. We're going to keep that in place." I mean, it's just truly incredible, Mike. And there's a historical element to this that I think it's important to understand. So remember, the discovery of the North Sea oil field changed Britain's their fortunes, in the 80s and 90s, just turned them into an energy powerhouse. But then they quit drilling, and some of the North Sea, reserves were declining. But Britain has amazing quantities of shale. The amount of gas in place in the shales in Britain are just enormous. Well, there's a historical precedent, as I mentioned, and during World War II, there's a book that was published called The Secret of Sherwood Forest. There were drillers that went from Oklahoma to Britain and drilled something like 100 wells in a span of about 18 months, if memory serves, dramatically increased oil production in Britain, did it all in secret. And that oil then was used in the war effort to help provide high octane gasoline for British airplanes. So if there is a crisis, and Britain is clearly in a crisis, why in the name of Peter, Paul, and Mary would they not start drilling again? But again, I think this, to me, it's indicative, and it'll jump ahead. What is this indicative of? I think it is indicative of this intransigence of the anti-hydrocarbon lobby and their many allies in the NGO world and in politics. And they don't want any kind of hydrocarbons to be developed, and they hate nuclear. And they have this fantastical notion around renewables, and they are incredibly powerful in political circles.
And you think of the consequences of that approach. They had a mild winter, which was a godsend, to them. But they're not always going to have mild winters. They've done nothing to really change the dynamic of their energy regime. We find the denial, and we did mention, Ontario nuclear. That was a positive. California saying, hey, the Diablo Canyon can keep going a little bit longer.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
To me, this reluctance to acknowledge just the facts that have happened, the consequences that have happened in terms of industrial output, industrial, base, jobs, individual really suffering at the lower end of the income scale, bodes very ill that we're going to revisit these and worse. And sorry, one aspect that gets overlooked in the West is that's already had devastating consequences in developing nations. Sure, Germany could afford to go out and buy natural gas, bid up the price and pay for it. Well, that took it out of the hands of Sri Lanka. I mean, no wonder India is being so belligerent or not cooperative to the West, when it comes to energy policy. The list is a long one. And I think the failure to acknowledge what they've already done in Africa in the negative, with estimates of 675 million people without electricity. I can go on in this because I find it so outrageous.
Well, let me give you a specific here, Mike, because this one I think is indicative of what, power politics when it comes to global energy, right? So what did Germany do after Russia's invasion of Ukraine? Well, Nord Stream got blown up, and, we're still, a lot of debate about who did it. Seymour Hersh's article has very strong belief, it's very strong indications it was the U.S. Now, is that provable? No, but I digress. But what did Germany do? They went around the world, started buying up LNG cargoes, every one that they could. And what did they do? They outbid Pakistan in particular. And so in the last few months, the Pakistanis have said, okay, we're out of the LNG market. We quit. We can't compete with the rich Germans. We're going to build coal plants. And that is in fact what they are doing. And so again, it goes back to the iron law of electricity. Politicians get booted out of office if the lights go out. I saw it here in Texas, right? The governor after the blackouts here 2 years ago, oh, don't blame me. It's those guys. Well, they're largely his appointees, but never mind. But what is Pakistan doing? They're tending to their own needs. What is India doing? What is China doing? They're all building coal-fired power plants because they know they have to have electricity, and they're going to do what they need to do for their economy. That is climate change takes its back seat always everywhere. And this is Roger Pilkey Jr.'s point, the iron law of climate change, that when faced between economic growth and action on climate, countries will always choose economic growth. And that's what we're seeing.
And that's the irony. I think Monty Python sits back and says they're angry that they've borrowed one of their scripts, because it's really, I mean, the number of things I've written or posted, and I start with, you can't make this up, as we alluded to earlier, because I'm just at a loss at the ideological driven climate change agenda without any practicality. And now we're seeing these consequences. And then consequences, by the way, let me ask you a question. Sorry, this is just like if we were having a beer, I'd ask you this question.
Yeah,
when do the people who have pushed that agenda have to take responsibility for it? Like one of the big issues on Money Talks, this is going back early, was, wait a second, you stop natural gas, you're impacting ammonia and urea and fertilizer prices. I mean, one of the best suggestions I had, and I think it was 220, I said, buy ammonia, in the futures because it went up 600%, but it was under that understanding. Well, you're going to starve people. You have to own your consequences. And there are consequences besides my electricity bill went up, or even that the, industrial base is being eroded. No, we were literally starving people. And they just take no responsibility. And in my opinion, if you vote for these people again, well, you got to own that consequence.
Yeah, and I'll take that point, but I also think things are starting to shift, Mike. I think especially in Europe, I think now let's leave Germany out of the conversation for a moment. But I just wrote in my piece on Substack, robertbryce.substack.com, the headline is "No U," the letter U, no uranium. pointing out that in Europe now there's a new nuclear alliance, and that there's 16 countries in this alliance who are saying we're going to develop our own nuclear supply chain, right? We're going to do it without the Russians. Okay, well, that's great, right? But I think it's indicative of energy realism. It's indicative of this. There is some sobriety that is approaching here now. Is it the same in Canada and the U.S.? Well, maybe. I'm not sure about Trudeau. I think he's always holding his finger up and see which way the wind is blowing. But I think there is still in the United States, we're seeing big regional differences. You don't see this kind of sobriety in California. Let me be clear. I mean, this is a state that is alike that this is the Germany of the United States when it comes to energy policy. And I'll just make one more quick point, which is that I've written a lot about California, and my daughter lives in Los Angeles. So I have to be, very understanding of what, of the state in general, but their energy policies are just ruinously regressive. And their electricity prices are now have risen faster than any other state in the United States since 2008. And it's all because of this renewable craziness. And yet they double down on it. So, I see some signs for hope, Mike. That's what I'm trying to focus on and be optimistic. But I'm also very aware and very sober about, well, where are we headed, and what do we need to do in terms of policy that makes sense?
Well, I'm in that camp that wants a wake-up call, and I say the evidence is in front of you. And I'm saying this from, hey, if climate change is your agenda, and that's fine, I have no debate. We can all have what our priorities are from government. I'm saying the very people who tell you they care about climate change and politics are undermining, as your example about the coal production going on in several other nations,
right.
Because of that climate agenda. I'm just still flabbergasted. And I just say, make whatever choice you want, but know the facts. Wake up a little bit to the consequences, within this. But I want to come back before I let you go to the uranium story. And the reason is, again, I can't give individual investment advice because I don't know everybody's circumstances. Right. But what I think you can make a strong case for is having a core position of uranium that you might say I'm keeping 5 to 7 years because I don't see anything but demand going up, and they can't meet the supply requirements to meet that new demand. I'm just standing back saying that's what it looks like to me.
Yeah. Well, I'll add, I don't own any uranium stocks myself. I'm just more of an index fund guy because I'm not smart enough to try and outsmart the market. But I do see, and I've had on my podcast, on the Power Hungry podcast, Adam Rosenswag, talking about the bull case for natural resources in general. And I think there is a strong case for the, base metals, copper, nickel, the metals that are going to be critical to any this build out of renewables and so on. But I think also it's important to remember, and I've had another guest on my podcast, Simon Michaud, talking about mining in general. And so far this year, I think copper has been pretty flat, right? Which is odd. It should be, in theory, should be going up, but so Simon Michaud was his name, talking about the fact that globally, these ore bodies, the quality of the ores that we're mining now in general across base metals are lower quality than the ones we were mining 10 or 20 years ago. Well, that means more energy intensity. It means that they're going to be harder to mine, harder to produce. And in theory, more, somebody's going to make some money on this. So, but I'll also add, the oil and gas market, there's been continuing underinvestment in oil, and this is an irreplaceable fuel. I like to say, well, if oil didn't exist, we would have to invent it. It is a damn near miracle substance. And the idea that we're going to do without it is just not based on anything close to reality, given the massive base of internal combustion engine vehicles that are on the road. What is 1.5 billion globally?
And back to the very first question I asked about myths, and that's got to be one of the big myths, is somehow we're not going to be using, oil, natural gas, coal. We're going to use energy. That's the premise. And if someone says we're not, then, try it yourself. You know what I mean? I say you first.
My punchline, Mike, is hydrocarbons are here to stay. Are wind and solar growing? Yes, but largely they're only adding to our energy supply. Yes. They're not displacing significant quantities of hydrocarbons on the global scale. Yes, in the electric sector in the U.S., you can make that argument, and I'll buy that. But last year alone in the U.S., I have these numbers, I've been presenting on it, just the growth in natural gas last year, and gas consumption in the U.S. went up 5%, which is a huge jump in 1 year. the 5% increase in natural gas was about 1.5 exajoules, I think, that just the increase in natural gas was greater than the increase in wind and solar combined. So this idea that hydrocarbons are suddenly going away, no, let's look at the numbers. The numbers do not indicate that there is an energy transition underway.
So much to talk about, and I want to invite people to go to the Power Hungry podcast. But you know what, Robert? You also do a Substack. I'm just kidding.
I do. RobertBryce.substack.com.
Yeah.
And I quite like it. And I did the piece on uranium and did some graphics there that I thought were really interesting. And, and I think Canada, I just, as I said, the Canada is going to be one of the partners for the U.S. when it comes to uranium supplies. Is going to be Canada and Australia, because I'm not sure we can rely on Kazakhstan. And now we know we can't rely on the Russians. And in fact, the Chinese and the Russians are vying for control or vying for supplies of uranium from Kazakhstan. So, it's a very dynamic world. And suddenly these supply chains that we thought were secure, not so much.
And it is a huge opportunity with our CANDU reactors, and as you say, Chris Kiefer's made some real progress on that. Canada does not have a great track record of taking full advantages of its energy opportunities. We haven't seen that because that's not been the priority. And I think that the Trudeau government actually is more disposed toward nuclear than they've been in the past, but they don't like to talk about it. Why? Because they don't want to offend. They've got the most extreme environment minister, literally, I think, in the Western world, Stephen Guilbeault, who I could tell you chapter and verse about him. He's, let's say he's committed, and maybe should be. Just kidding. Can't resist.
Yeah.
But, but again, the opportunities there, God knows the work that you do helps present. It's fact-based. That's why I say I've been really enjoying your work on Power Hungry, really enjoying, Substack, but other things you do and your books. So again, I'm going to put you on the spot and say, we got to visit again in the near future, because this is terrific.
No, I'd love to do it, Mike. I'm passionate about these issues. Yeah. I feel, well, I'm incredibly lucky in my career, right? I've been a reporter my whole life, never had a real job. And I feel incredibly fortunate to be writing about these issues and finding an audience, frankly. And I work hard, let me be clear, but my life has purpose, and this is my purpose, to try and bring some sanity and clarity and
facts and research,
to these issues, because the energy and power sectors are our most important industries. Every other industry depends on them. And yet there's been a very kind of a cavalier approach to them and how we think about them and talk about them. And my response is, no. We have to be very, very careful in how we think about them. And I think you want to close here, but I'll just end with this. We have to remember that for a lot of this discussion, this is a quasi-religious belief for a lot of people. Yeah. And so disabusing them of some of these belief systems is going to be very hard. But I think it has to be seen in those kinds of terms, that there is the overlap between a lot of the climatism and Christianity. Some of the terms, the ideas of sin and redemption, very similar. So this is not an easy fight. It's not going to be over anytime soon. And I just, pack a lunch, because these issues are going to be around for a long time.
Well, my worry is that the consequences become so dire, and we've seen them in other parts of the world, as I alluded to, that you're forced to wake up. I love that line in the war between physics and virtue signaling. Physics is undefeated, and that's where we're at. Robert, thanks so much for a great time.
It's a great pleasure, Mike. Thanks. Be happy to come back anytime.